Welcome to our Arizona Daily Star opinion reader chat on Thursday. I can't believe we're coming up on a year of doing these every Thursday. It seems like a very long time, but it also seems like it was just yesterday that all this was starting. But we are here and privileged to have Deborah Douglas, my friend and marvelous author, with us. She's an amazing journalist. She's an author of the Moon U.S. Civil Rights Trail book. It's a traveler's guide to the people, places, and events that made the movement. That's from Moon Publishers. And she's going to talk us through that. Deb has been, she's a visiting professor at DePauw. She's written all sorts of things, everything from, as she was just saying, about trails and bird migrations to being the managing editor of the MLK 50 Justice Through Journalism Reporting Project. So with that, I will introduce Sarah Brown, who is our opinion coordinator who handles letters and will be taking us through kind of the how we do this.
Welcome everybody. So I do see a few new faces today. So just as a few reminders, we are going to definitely open this up for discussion. So we encourage your questions, thoughts, and you can do that a couple different ways. We have the chat feature, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. So you're welcome to submit your comments or questions there, as well as raising your virtual hand. As more people join, it gets a little harder to see your physical hand, although we will look for that if you can't figure it out. But to raise your virtual hand, it depends on the device you're on. But if you're on a PC, you should be able to just click reactions at the bottom of your screen, and then you'll see one that's a raised hand, not the clap one, it's like a raised hand. If you're on an Apple device, more than likely you're going to need to press participants and then your name and then raised hand, or it could be 3 dots that say more and then you raise your hand that way. So we look forward to your participation, and maybe try to keep your comments to about 30 seconds or less. That way we can entertain as many questions for Deborah as possible.
Thank you. So I would just like to open up the floor to Deborah, and I'm so thrilled that you're with us, and I really am. I've sent your book to my parents, so and bought it myself, of course. So why don't you, how did you get started in doing this particular travel book?
Well, it syncs up nicely with the kind of journalism that I do. As you mentioned, I was the founding managing editor of MLK 50, which originally was established to cover Memphis and the economic realities of Memphis, Tennessee, leading into the 50th commemoration of Dr. King's assassination there. For years, I've been a contributing writer to The Crisis. It's the 100-year-old plus magazine of the NAACP. And then a lot of the issues that I've covered in my career as a writer and as the deputy editorial page editor at the Chicago Sun-Times and a columnist really dovetail nicely into this theme. At the Sun-Times, I've focused on innocence and wrongful convictions, for example. So in addition to having expertise on covering health and wellness, I followed that path into covering equity and justice, because you can easily find equity issues that have been unaddressed in the healthcare realm. So the opportunity to write my book, here it is. It was presented to me, actually. So in 2018, a group of Southern travel offices got together and designated an official civil rights trail in the South. And they were pointing these out and making these designations well before 2018. And they were basing their decisions on research at places like the University of Georgia and other experts. And Moon Travel, a longtime travel company, they're the ones who decided they wanted to cover the official trail. And I was invited into the proposal process. So I had to compete to be able to get the contract to write this book. But everything that I am and everything that I've done really kind of prepared me for this moment. So this is the first and only book that covers the official trail. Now, I said in the South that these Southern travel offices established the trail, but actually the trail starts as far east as Wilmington, Delaware, and as far west as Topeka, Kansas, and it goes down into Louisiana and into Florida, and new sites are being added on a regular basis.
That's so cool. That's a really inane thing to say about the Civil Rights Trail, but I think that's bringing them, connecting those dots, literally. It makes such a difference. From the preface in the book, you write, there is power in connecting to the places where successful resistance began. Can you talk a bit about that and what these places mean, just historically, but also culturally and as part of the American story?
Yes, so I don't know about you guys, when you get ready to go travel, whether or not it's domestically or internationally, I spend weeks and months doing research before I actually go anyplace. So I go online, I read books, I get any kind of collateral material that's available, like, brochures and maps, anything I can get my hands on. And I will say that in my experience, as a matter of course, Black American stories are not necessarily curated for cultural experiences or cultural exploration. I think we can think of places here and there, but just, as sort of like, okay, the default experience of going to particular cities, our spaces and narratives are not necessarily curated this way. So I thought it was important to do this research and create this book for that reason. And I don't think that it stops with this book. I think that this is the beginning of many movements to do the same thing. That line about successful, that word successful that I used, well, I'm very clear that I'm covering the mid-century civil rights movement. And I'm not quite sure that anybody can say that it ended. Those issues that they were addressing certainly didn't end. And now here we are in the period of Black Lives Matter. But I said successful because certain things did happen, like a spate of civil rights acts that were passed at the end of the 60s, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We just commemorated the 56th anniversary of that this past weekend, and the Housing Act, which was one of the civil rights acts. So, there was progress, but still there was more progress to be made. There's progress to be made to this day. So I said successful because when you think about, the risks that people took during the movement and then the danger that they faced even before they rose up, you could look back at that story, you could look at that narrative and view it through what I call a deficit frame. Oh, look at these poor people, and you could define them by the worst thing that's ever happened to them without really valuing and understanding their life in full, not just the pain, but also the joy. And so I learned this from connecting with the solutions journalism people, and specifically Trabian Shorters. He's on the board of Solutions Journalism Network, but I got a chance to meet him with one of his programs. He founded the Be Me communities, and Trabian introduced me to the concept of asset framing. And that is where you define people, or you approach people by their vision for their lives, by their aspirations. And so to me, journalistically, what that means is that I am giving sort of like a 363-degree look or level of engagement with people's stories, and not deficit framing them by this horrible thing that happened to them, because that seeps into our conversations, and then that goes into policy, and then becomes norms, and then it's terrible.
Yeah. Dave, do you have any questions? And please go ahead if you'd like to raise your hand and put questions in the chat.
Here I am sucking up. As I ordered your book, I was so, well, because I've traveled to such places, but to have such a comprehensive guide is so awesome. But I was surprised, what a dope, to see how beautiful a book it is in terms of the art of the book itself. I mean, not only, I'm sure your content is wonderful, but visually it's also it's a wonderful object.
Thank you, David. That means a lot coming from you as an artist. And artists are my favorite people in any newsroom. And I do not minimize the impact that that artistry does contributes to the process of connecting and understanding any narrative that you're trying to share with the public. And I'm just really fortunate that I had an editor and a team that cared enough to create something different. It doesn't look and feel like the typical travel book as far as I'm concerned. It has like a light green cover, which kind of evokes the green book a little bit, right? It's got this comprehensive map in the back. Is like a map geek who used maps as my artwork when I was in college because I had no money. But I love maps. I mean, I sit and I read the atlas for fun sometimes. And when I'm around people who actually like me, like my cousin Brian, he's like, Deb, you act like you want to leave us. Put the map away. Just hang out with us. Be with us. But I'm thinking about where I'm going to go next. And I love the way that the photos are optimized. I took 85% of the photos. Wow. And I've taken photos over the course of my career because we work in the news business. We have to do everything, right? But I'm not a trained photographer. And so the way I just feel so honored and respected the way that my images were optimized to make them as inviting as they were in real life.
I do have a question. In one of the interviews, I saw that you mentioned that you had personal connections to some of the icons who were significant in the story. Could you talk about that, your personal connections?
Well, it's funny. I interviewed Diane Nash when Dick Gregory died a few years ago. Oh. And one of my ideas for this book was to make sure I gave women a platform in my book, because, you know, there was sort of like that male-female schism back during that time. And I thought, oh, it'll be so easy. I have her email address and I have her phone number. But it took months to get that interview. And I was of a mindset that I did not want to like let go. Like, what do journalists who get the story, you know, what do? They never give up. So like I had this never give up mindset. And I tried to like follow up in a way that was like non-stalkery.
I just said that earlier this week to Sarah.
Yes.
I said, if I send one more email to this person, I'm going to be a stalker.
Right. So I was trying to like calibrate all of that and have like a positive attitude, because I really do think like the energy you bring to something like kind of dictates the outcome. But this one day I was getting towards the end of having to like let it go. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to have to give up on Diane. And then she called me out of the blue. And then she was like, Deborah, I got all of your messages. So there was that. And then in Chicago, it's the headquarters of the Rainbow Push Coalition, founded by Rev Jackson. And so my work with innocence and wrongful convictions connected to some of the work that was coming out of Rainbow Push. So I got to tell, the Reverend comes on the scene in this period that I'm covering, but he really flourishes, you know, well beyond that. But I got to tell a very specific story about his role in getting the markets closed on King Day. I don't know if you guys remember that when King Day initially passed, it was celebrated in a haphazard way, and I think where you were, not at all. But yeah. People, they're like, well, do we take the day off? I'm like, well, do you take the day off for other national holidays? Like, why is it like a question of what we do on a federal holiday? And so actually the this story was related to me by his son, Jonathan Jackson, who's the national spokesman for Rainbow Push. And Jonathan told me years ago that he and his dad were touring the New York Stock Exchange. And Jonathan, whispered in his dad's ear, "Dad, ask him how come the markets aren't closed on King Day." And so the Reverend turned and asked Dick Grasso, who was the chairman at the time. And Dick said, "I don't know. Let me ask the board." And I got this from Dick too, because I called Dick Grasso and I interviewed him to get his side of the story and his recollection. We're good friends now, but that the board voted to close the markets on King Day. And, it took the next year for that to occur. But ever since then, we've been celebrating King Day like a real deal Holyfield federal holiday with no questions asked. And it's because the country shifted its priorities from making money that day to holding a sacred space for everything that Dr. King believed in.
Monica.
I'm sorry, Reverend Jackson. I was surprised the other day when I saw him. Like all of us, he's mortal. He has gray. What hair he has is gray. It's like, wow.
He's awesome. I went and gave him a book and we took selfies. And he wanted to talk about, it was some deep economic idea that he had. He never turns it off. He is brilliant. And he's always thinking about the next big thing in the public conversation about equity, equality, and the economy.
Wow. Monica, Sarah will unmute you. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. As soon as Sarah announced last week that you were going to be coming, I went online, of course, to read all about your book. And I've ended up with a question that I'd just like to ask you about. And that is, I give gifts to my great nieces and nephews, and I have several of them between the ages of 10 and 12. And I haven't seen the book myself, so I can't make a judgment yet. But I'm just wondering, do you think that it's accessible, at least to a degree, for good readers at that age? Because these families travel, and I would love to have the kids start saying, let's go to some of these places that I read about. So what are your thoughts about younger kids, but not young children reading it?
I wrote this book with kids in mind because a lot of places where I traveled to, I bumped into bus loads full of kids, and I talked myself onto their buses and rode around with them so that I could experience certain activities through their eyes. That was the most fun thing. And I'm still connected to some of those organizations today. But I made so many friends, and I have so many like quasi family members now. But also, it's so funny you should mention that, Monica, because last night I started working in earnest on my curriculum guide to accompany this book. So I literally have like 8 tabs open because I'm looking at different styles of curriculum guides, people that I respect. I was looking at Robin DiAngelo's curriculum guide. There's a guy in Florida, Paul Ortiz, who I respect greatly. I'm looking at how he's communicated some of his ideas. And then I have the Common Core standards open because I'm trying to figure out how to organize it in a way where I can get the different clumps of grades. This is definitely for high schoolers. They're going to start, going on those trips in earnest. But I don't want to miss out on the middle schoolers either. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out how to follow the Common Core standards and package it in a way where it's easily accessible online to engage with as you use this book. Because there isn't a book in a travel vein that contextualizes the trail. This really, Charles Cobb, who's a civil rights treasure in and of himself, wrote a trail book. But this is totally updated. It's the only thing covering the official trail. And to David's point about just the visual interest that's been created with it, you have an enhanced experience that way too.
Great, thank you.
So Deb, you've been a journalist for how long now?
30 years, but if I go by, like when I got the keys to the town paper when I was a freshman in college, 34.
How do you think it's changed? in terms of what we do. I know you're an opinion journalist too.
Yay.
I don't know, what are your thoughts? I know we've talked about this
Yeah.
before, but how do you weigh in on it?
Well, when I was starting, first of all, I'm excited that my profession is the one that's mentioned in the Constitution. Like,
Cool.
you can debate the relevance of us all you want to, but we're in the Constitution, so what? And so, I also feel like that's a beacon too. Like, that's a beacon for us. That is like a call to a higher purpose and to do better than what we've done in any given day, because we have a charge. And I don't think it's a mission, because when you start talking mission stuff, they don't want to pay you, but I want to get my money. but it is kind of a mission. And so when I first started, I just wanted to get in, and of course you want to follow the instructions, right? And you believe in this awesome democratic experiment, and you identify yourself as someone who has an affinity for telling stories, so you want to figure out how to do that at the highest level, sharpen your craft every day, that sort of thing. Now I'm a critique of the media. I am a critic of the media. I have a critique. And so I practice journalism. I teach, but I still practice. I'm a contributing writer to Chicago Magazine, and I write for other people. I actually like operate in this sort of like double consciousness. So I do my work, but then I interrogate how I'm doing my work, and then how that will play out with the people that I'm writing for. And I'm always calibrating for equity, justice, and the asset framing and deficit framing that we talked about. So recently, I wrote the story for Chicago Magazine, their new power list. And it's like, I think it's 30 in the come up. And well, because it was me writing it, and because of just the nature of what we experienced in 2020, the list had kind of like an equity bent to it, because our lives are about just connecting people to the things that could sustain us and save lives. And so I found myself, being really careful with the language that I use, and really interrogating, like, well, how do you know this is powerful? And what does this power look like? Is it established power that has been bestowed upon someone because of how they were born and the wealth that they are able to access because of that? Or is it another kind of experience-driven, lived experience, people-powered sort of power? And I remember having conversations with my editor, one person who was a strong candidate for the list. At one point, towards the end of the process, there was a conversation about, well, I don't think this person is powerful because they didn't get anything done. And I had to really think about that. Like, then why did I think that this person is powerful then? And I decided in the parking lot of Mariano's grocery market that that this person was powerful because of how they spent 2020 speaking truth to power. That when you speak out, there are consequences attached to speaking out. You put yourself in risk of danger. You put yourself at risk of reward too, but you put yourself at risk of danger. And this person was speaking on behalf of a lot of other people who were vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable already, and then you call attention to yourself, what can happen to you, So I'm like, this person is powerful. Just because he doesn't have this snap your finger kind of power and make something happen doesn't make the person powerful. Sometimes being powerful is speaking truth to power. And then, then I like, because I'm a team player, I'm like, okay, let me really consider what my editor was asking me. And but me being clear and where I was coming from helped me, like, okay, put that off to the side. Now let's interrogate this from my editor's point of view and imagine where he's coming from. And then I realized that, oh, but if you get outside of the bubble that is Chicago, and you compare how this person, who he represents, to other states, and what his counterparts have been going through and what they've done, this person is powerful because he kept all hell from breaking loose, basically. He didn't get everything done, but he kept it from getting worse.
That is sometimes in a situation like that, yeah, that is keeping things together is the real power. Kent,
Oh, you gotta unmute yourself first, Kent.
Sorry, I was banging on my keyboard a minute ago, so sorry for the bumps.
There we go.
No
Sorry for
problem.
the delay. Fascinating topic. I'm curious, who makes the decision or how are decisions made with regard to what is featured? And what sort of controversies exist with regard to that issue?
Ding, ding, ding. Oh, so, okay, so, you know, part of the proposal process is to present a strong vision for what you think a cohesive narrative would look like. So we hewed pretty closely to that proposal. And with this being the first ever of whatever this is, you know, you're clearly going to go to places that are on the official trail, places that have been officially designated. And then you're going to look around, you know, the area and then see what other pieces of history you can add to that. But I also had to stay really super focused because it was super easy to veer off into Black history and not civil rights history, like the whole of it. So somebody sent me an email about this Ida B. Wells Museum. And I'm like, but that wasn't the civil rights era. That was something else. I love Ida. She's like my idol, but don't tell my mother. She doesn't like idol worship. But, you know, I couldn't fit that in. Also, to the point of the watching my language, Kent, I was clear to calibrate my language in this book. So I don't call people slaves. I use the word enslaved because being a slave, that's not an identity. That's not who those people were. That was a condition. They were enslaved, right? And that better describes the condition of not being able to, you know, move and be free. Also, I was really clear about when I talked about Blackness. And this is just beyond this book. It's in all kinds of writing. Like I wrote an article for Oprah magazine where I had to be really careful about how I use the word Black, because I have friends who are Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latina and Afro-Canadian, right? And then you have like Black Brits. Like I like to go hang out in London, kick it over there. So I had to be really careful when I was talking about Blackness, like which Black people? You know, things like that. And so I know my editor, she noticed that pattern of the use of enslaved, and she asked me about it. And I just explained my reasoning to her. And also capitalizing Black. So journalistically, we haven't been capitalizing Black forever. And last year was the first time organizations started making the shift. And so I made that decision that I would capitalize Black too. And I just don't go, oh, let's just do this. I always have reasons for that. And so, you know, I shared my reasons for that. And my editor was totally on board. At one point when I started getting page layouts, the photographs in the book were supplemented by archival photos and some stock photos, because there's just some things a professional photographer is going to do 1,000 times better than I would. So like for the African American Museum in DC, we have a 2-page spread photo of that. And so at one point, I looked at a couple of pages, and with that particular museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I think it is, a culture and history. I get the last two names mixed up. Anyway, I looked at, as someone who has worked with artists and who's directed photo shoots, I've hired from the best agencies, Ford Elite, you know, I have developed artistic concepts. I think deeply about these things, even though I'm an editor. I looked at the image and I looked at the teeny tiny people in the bottom, and I looked to see who they were, and they were all white people outside of the Black Museum. Now I go to DC a lot, and one of my favorite things to do is to go stand in line so I can go in there and eat. So I know there are all kinds of people in that museum, but the stock photo only had one kind of person in it. And so then I turned to another page and looked at Charleston, at the Charleston City Market. And it was like this mad crush of people going under an archway. And it was a nice photo because they had this arch and it had the name of the market on it. And I looked at the people and I'm like, they were all white people. Like, not one black person. I mean, this is Charleston, one of the largest ports for enslaved Africans, right? So I called my editor and I said, today I want to talk about the white gaze.
Ah,
I said, who are these white people in my book? And so I said, you know what? I said, I know that you bought these images off the shelf, but here's the deal with that. I said, you have consciousness and I have consciousness, and we've calibrated for full representation of everybody, especially the people who belong in the story and the rest of the book. I said, but I want to make sure that we apply the same standard across the board. We need a photo that has Black people in it. And I bet you can't find it, from a stock photo agency, because the agency is not thinking about that. They're just thinking about, they want a beautiful photo. And so that means that we have to check ourselves, and we have to check the vendors that we work with, and then the vendors have to check the people that they hire. I'm like, and that is how we're going to affect change and how we're going to get true equity. We've just got to pull that string all the way through. So we decided on another image that doesn't have any people in it for that double page spread on the DC Museum. And I don't know, I forgot with Charleston, we may have kept that one, I'm not sure. But my editor was like, I never really thought about that. But I think about it all the time, because I open up publications or I'll go online. And if you're having an experience where you're having a degree of intimacy and excitement and you're being invited into a process or an experience, sometimes you want to see yourself reflected back too. And when you're consistently not reflected back, it makes it feel like you don't matter. And I created a word for that called depresencing. And it's actually in another book that I wrote that's out this year. It's on the New York Times bestseller list.
I was just
400
going to mention that. Yeah, can you tell us about that book and your participation in it?
Yeah, what's the title? There's a little bit of a glare, so it's hard to see what the.
Okay, it's 400 Souls, a community history of African America, 1619 to 2019. And it was edited by Ibram X. Kendi, who's the guru of all things anti-racist, and Keisha M. Blaine. And it has essays and poems and by 90 writers, thinkers, and poets. And it takes, I think it approaches 400 years of being Black in the United States. It takes it in like chunks of years. And so I was given a chunk of years around the theme of Katrina. And so I write about the aftermath of Katrina. And I was like, what do I care about? Like, I have this like general prompt, write about Katrina. What am I gonna say? So I'm like, well, what do I care about? And what am I working on now? Like, what is like the thing running on background that I'm trying to push to the front? And I've been thinking about a word to describe a very particular way I feel like white patriarchy responds to Black women, as evidenced by a bunch of research. And so I wanted, and I could have applied it to all women, but I wanted to be like super, super focused. And so I decided to like focus my word on the experience of Black women. And it's called depresencing. And it's just a way that white patriarchy has of ignoring the humanity, the heat, the physical presence of Black women in physical spaces, but also in narratives. And like, I have lots of examples of that. And I felt like this is what happened to the women of Katrina. And then, that was a hunch. Then I had to go research it to validate that. And I found lots of research that showed how these women's lives, narratives, lived experience were not reckoned with. And I know we have a word called erasure, but erasure presumes that you exist in the first place. What is the name of the word, the series of actions that happens when you're never fully rendered, as if you were never here? And so that's why I created that word.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
No, go. I was just going to say what is it? How do you create a word? And are you using, no, I think it's awesome, but should we all be carrying it forward and getting it into the lexicon?
I would love if you would do that. If anybody here writes for Wikipedia, have at it. I've written about it in this book. I wrote about it in a case, a story that I wrote in Memphis, where what I wrote ended up getting the September issue of the 2019 issue of Memphis Magazine pulled off the shelves altogether and dumped from the warehouses.
That's a story. What?
Yeah.
That's like way better than Stop the Presses.
Yeah, you're right. So that I used it in that case, and I've used it in a couple of other cases. And I seeded it on Twitter because I needed a timestamp to get the copyright. Because like, you gotta think ahead. We can't be present because we gotta think ahead.
Wow. Dave, what were you gonna say?
Oh, first question was silly. When do you sleep and eat? Second question was about the nurturing of a delightful storyteller like yourself. And when you consider subject matter, I find grim, you still manage to be a wonderful storyteller to listen to or to read. So how do you nurture a storyteller? What happened to you? Was it high school? Was it a journalism teacher? Was it a parent?
Oh, I don't know. Well, yeah, my mom is a storyteller, and she told a lot of great migration stories. This is why we live here. You know, this is how I grew up, that sort of thing. She grew up in an evangelical tradition, so I also grew up surrounded by testimony. And but one of my favorite teachers of all times was this man named Mr. Bearish, and he was Jewish, and that matters for this story because he was my social studies teacher for 2 years. I was skipped a grade in 4th grade. They didn't have room for me in 4th grade, so they just put me in 5th grade just because they had a chair. It was so random, but so Mr. Bearish taught me for a couple of years, and he only taught the Holocaust. He would just sit at his desk and tell us stories about the Holocaust. Sometimes he would tell us like Dickens movies, but mostly it was the Holocaust. And the way you got a grade in his class is that you wrote papers about geography. So you could write a paper about a city, a state, a country. And then we didn't have art, so he would encourage you to draw a picture to illustrate a concept associated with your paper. And then once a year, you would write a letter to a head of state, like the Queen of England or something. Stupid me, I wrote to the head of Indonesia, and they didn't write me back. I feel salty about that still. But so he told us stories, and he just like, in terms of my education, he just made my life. And I was prolific in his class. Like, he just really gave me permission to basically, if I wanted to know about something, to go find it out. And I had the validation of getting the good grades I got in his class and having all my papers plastered along the wall, to the point that it irritated some people. I don't care. But so there's that. And the idea that, okay, my grandparents were sharecroppers. They picked cotton. One of my grandmothers grew cucumbers, pickling cucumbers. One of my grandfathers fostered horses. They slapped hogs. They had cows. And I grew up with chickens. I grew up, feeding the chickens and browning the biscuits. I'm lucky to have had an urban experience and then a rural experience too. And the idea that I could come from that kind of background, that had sort of like, that was surrounded by this invisible ring of racial terror, and then to get up every morning and go, what do I want to do today? And then just to go do it is amazing. I mean, I'm just in awe. My life is a miracle. Do we have a lot that we need to fix? We do, but my life is a miracle.
Thank you.
I was just curious, Deborah, like when you were talking about your book about the Civil Rights Trail, and you said you ran into all those kids, that were kind of, visiting. I was just wondering, like, what were the kids' understanding of this? Like, did they really, because I know that's something that's really discussed today, like, there needs to be more education in school on a lot of these matters because people are just completely clueless, and then we have clueless adults. So I just was curious, like, Where were the kids? Did the kids understand like why this was important or what it was all about, or just kind of the feelings you got from them?
I bumped into the smart kids. You could tell that these kids, they had done preparation before they even embarked upon their trail. The adults that were surrounding them were engaging them in really rich and robust conversations. And I have two ways that I show up when I travel places. There's the Deborah that's like, 1000% reporter, all in your face. What do you think? What do you want? Talk, talk, talk. I decided to be the other Deborah who laid back in the cut and just observed. So I didn't get close to a lot of kids and like pepper them with a lot of questions. I just like laid back and just like, watch the information, wash over their faces and just watch how they interacted with people. So like there's this travel guide in Selma. Her name is Joanne Bland. And she attended her first movement meeting when she was 8 years old with her grandmother. And she was a part of the Bloody Sunday March when she was 11 years old. And she's a tour guide today. And she is the archetypical Black grandmother, full of sass. And, she's kind of bossy, like, move over here, move over there. But it's in a fun, comical way. She's like, now I'm going to say this and I want you to remember. And then a few minutes later, she goes, now, what did I just say? And then if the kids hesitate, she's like, I thought you said you were going to remember, so I was like, just looking at them relate to her. I'm like, what if you live with this woman or she was in your community? Because that's where I grew up. So it was just nice to see the kids relating to people like in a one-on-one intimate way like that.
Do we have any other, we have a couple comments.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure she heard those. Everybody's really loving you.
Okay.
Yeah, Sarah, could you read those, please?
Yeah, so Deborah, I love your focus on creating the right language. Sarah Gasson is right. It is awesome. Also thanking you for your excellent presentation. And Deborah, you are so inspiring. I feel fortunate to hear you today in the chat and can't wait to read your book.
Thank you. I appreciate all of that.
So when you go to these places, how did you knew where you were going, you knew part of what you would find. How did you decide what to keep in the book? Because I know there's like restaurants and shops and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I had massive spreadsheets, first of all, categorized and previously researched. So I had like my marching orders, but then I had to remain flexible because I wanted to meet people on the ground and then be led to places and discover, new places and new people. And so I call people ahead of time. The journalist in me does not like to show up anywhere without my name being on the list. So I can get in, I gotta get in. So I would let people know that I was coming. So somebody was on the other side to receive me, just so I could just be really efficient with my time. And so I wasn't missing people. And I'm also pretty good at figuring out the rhythm of people's days, so I can insinuate myself to get the things that I need. So I did a lot of pre-research like that. And then I had like a golden goose in every place that I went to. Like, this is the person I gotta meet. So if I wasn't able to connect ahead of time, then I would get there and I would start putting out feelers to find the golden goose.
Kathy.
I apologize. There was some street work and our power went out. So I missed some of it. It's back on, obviously, but for a while it was blackout. Oh my God, what am I gonna do? I wondered, I agree with you that the power of language is essential, and defining that language is essential as well. Do you have a website where you define your neologisms so that people can go and see how you define them as opposed to letting somebody else define them?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, Kathy. I do not have that, but I think I need to go make it now.
Sure. Just in your copious free time.
Right, exactly.
So I'm curious, Deb, with so Deborah and I know each other from being part of the Journalism and Women's Symposium group. It's a I can never define it. How do you define it, Deb?
We're the Women's Journalism Association, and Sarah and I always agree on everything.
Yes, we do.
That is a rare thing to say about anyone anymore.
Also true. Yeah. Do you think that is the audience that you're writing for, when you write about culture and society and race and equity, do you think that has the audience changed at all for your work in terms of, are you educating people with your approach, or are you, maybe that's not an or question, or are you finding that people are becoming more accustomed to these sort of concepts and accepting of the reality that we live in an equitable society?
Yeah, no, I don't think that. I think people having some consciousness that something happened bad last year, but in terms of like how it applies to our lives, or the institutions that we engage with, that's a hard nut to crack. And it's the reason why my book is just not in the past. That's why I asked Bree Newsome to write my foreword, because I wanted a young person tethered to a modern movement to have a voice in the book. And it's why I have resources at the back of the book where I talk about modern movements, and I give reading lists and movie lists and podcasts and hashtags and handles so that you can engage with the themes of the movement that continue to define our lives today. And also, I just think the work of journalism, I'm coming to this conclusion stronger and stronger every day. I think that journalism should be about the business of unpacking structure, how society is structured, and who has access and who doesn't. I mean, if we said this is a more perfect union, then how do we narrate the idea or the journey of how we make that union more perfect? And so I think that we focus too much on established power and the needs of established power, and we don't center the stories and experiences of other people enough in our journalistic narratives. And the best way to righteously do that and be a public service is to unpack structure.
I would vote for you for anything.
I was kind of curious, you had talked, or I don't want to veer totally off in the wrong direction, but earlier you had talked about how you had spent some time on the innocence and wrongful conviction. It was a team or group, or I'm not quite sure, but I just was curious hearing a lot more about that. I mean, it's just so devastating, and I think it happens way more than people realize. But I just was kind of curious what all your work involved, or.
Yeah, well, in Chicago, we have a couple of innocence projects, one at Northwestern, and there's some other work being done. But a lot of people who are advocating on behalf of the innocent and wrongfully conviction were and or have been and are white people. And so when I was on the editorial board, Jonathan Jackson, the national spokesperson for the Rainbow Push Coalition, he was working with this group of people. And he made the point that this was an opportunity for our community to speak into something that more directly affects us than other people, because these are people in our community, or they could be our family members, that sort of thing. And that intrigued me. And so when I was downsized from the Sun-Times, because if you're, as a manager, I cut people for years, and eventually you'll have to cut yourself, right? I continue writing about these issues because I thought, well, this is one way for me to do some righteous journalism, but also this is a way for me as an African-American to speak into an issue that directly affects my community. So, and we had one of the worst perpetrators of torture in the country. That was Lieutenant Commander John Burge. He was a Chicago police commander. And I covered his trial. It took years to bring him to trial, but apparently he brought some torture tactics that he learned fighting in the war back home with him. And so he would torture people in custody to get confessions. And so people were wrongfully convicted. some of these people did bad things, but not that time. And that's not the way you get the conviction, to torture people. We don't do that. And then some people are just straight up innocent in a lot of the cases that I covered. And so, and we have like a whole reparations movement around innocence and wrongful convictions in Chicago. And there is a decree that it has to be taught in our public schools.
Wow. I'm pretty sure Arizona does not have that decree, sadly. With you teach also at DePauw, right?
Yes.
How do you find your students coping with being remote, doing journalism? How do you, and I'm asking sort of selfishly because I just want to copy you. How do you, I work with students at the U of A, and one of the things that I've realized is for us as journalists working from home or being remote, it can be frustrating, but we already know these people, we have credibility, we know the sources, we're not trying to knock from entirely the inside. So how do you help your students with that, coping with the pandemic and everything that can present to a young journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I really want my students to learn and get better at their journalism skills, but I view my first duty is to not kill their spirit. I think that newsrooms can be spirit killing, and I just don't think that is the way to enter into this work. And it doesn't mean that that's the way that you need to live and thrive in this work. So I just make room for them to be who they are. I do check-ins with them, to calibrate, how they're doing. Zooming all the time can be work. And if I have to work harder or more offline or do more one-on-one, like I did just before this call, then I'll do that. So the student feels fully supported. And then in some cases, I have to make some decisions on how to make some things different. Like in a pandemic, you can't be walking around just talking to strangers.
Yeah, there's no more man on the street interviews.
Yeah, so like they have an assignment due next week, and I'm just trying to talk to them early and often about this particular assignment has to do with identifying a main character, and I don't want them to talk to people that they know. There's Michelle Weldon has the 50 person rule. You can't invite 50 people. You can't write about the 50 people you would invite to a party at your house.
Good rule.
Yeah. And so I've amended it at DePauw because it's a small campus, and I made it a 25 person rule. But for this, I've shared this rule with my students, and I said, but talk to me, tell me what's on your mind, tell me what your constraints are, and let's walk through this relationship that you have with this person so we can help figure out if this is the appropriate person to focus on. So like I just cleared a student to interview a student in one of her classes. She's not a friend, but she was somebody who was in a class, and she has some insight that might lend itself to this particular story. So I cleared that. So it's like slowing it down, talking through it, making sure they know what the rules are, and then understanding that this is a case where we're breaking form for this reason, but this is really the standard that you'll need to follow if you continue in this work.
Thank you. Kent.
Oh, you've got to accept the unmute first, Kent.
There we go.
There you go.
Sorry. You mentioned your interest in structures, and I was wondering which structures interest you the most and why?
Well, I will tell you that when I was traveling over the past a year and a half, I would end up in communities, like I would go to like the historic Black community of Nashville or the historic Black community of Little Rock, or like any number of communities. And then I would, and they would go, oh, and we used to do this. And then we had this person danced here. And then, oh, and then this person played here. They went up and they blew up and got really famous. And I'm like, well, what happened to all of that? Why didn't the community like sustain? And then they were like, oh, the interstate came through. the interstate came through. And so when you look at if you look at writing about the development of the interstates, you'll see that a lot of those interstates cut right through Black communities. And if you go back and look at the conversation and news articles about what communities were saying at that time, they were saying, please don't run the interstate through our community. They were like, nah, your community is Black and poor. We don't care. And they would build the interstate anyway. So they just cut through and destroyed all these relationships, and the institutions by cutting through these communities. And then what I found out is that, well, why did they look at these communities in the first place? Well, a lot of the interstate development was informed by the redlining maps that began to be developed in the 1930s. And I don't know, you should do this, but you can go on and look up where you were born on the redlining map. If you're like in a big city or even a medium-sized city. I did that. I went to look up where I was born to see what the redlining map said about what my outcomes would be. Now, I was born on the west side of Chicago, but it was kind of like we integrated. My mother was like, those people were looking at us like we were crazy. We integrated. So the predictions for a baby born where I was born was, the outcomes were pretty high. But then I went down the road to an area called K-Town, where my friend John Fountain, who wrote a book about growing up in K-Town, a poor area on the west side, he wrote a book called True Vine. And the outcomes for John, who is amazing, he's a multi-published author, columnist, professor, written for the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it said that this is a mostly Black community and these people are going to fail at life. Basically, if you look at how they, like the indicia and how they write it out, these people have no prospects. And so I think about, we're born and there's a map of our lives that dictates what's supposed to happen to us. Oh my God. And if you go online and you look at I think it's called the Opportunity Atlas, you can also see how that plays out by looking up zip codes of where people were born. So I'm interested in things like that, because as we engage with the issues, like whether or not we should have a federal rescue, as a result of the pandemic, it's not always about like what's happening at this moment. It's about how we constructed our lived experience as we, live through them. And what do we need to go back and correct from the past in order to create better outcomes for people in the future?
Can't believe we're at our hour. Dave, do you have any final questions or patients?
Dave, you muted yourself.
I love it.
Dave, can't hear you.
Dave, unmute yourself.
Here's the old boomer.
There it
Unmute
is.
yourself. Well, these internets.
There we are.
I love it.
There's
That is so cute. She's cuter than I am.
The Shiva goddess.
Yes, I'll send that to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us and talking about your book and the Civil Rights Trail and all the awesome things that you were doing.
Yes.
I appreciate your time and everybody's attention. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks. And let's stay in touch.
Okay, we will.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.